Westerners, but they are trying to describe things which are quite widespread in China, but relatively less known elsewhere. This is the use of public surveys, the use of questionnaires, the use of feedback, and the use of consulting large numbers of people before you actually do things. And a recent example is when the maglev, the famous magnetic levitation train in Shanghai, was extended. A whole lot of people turned around and responded to the consultation by saying, no, we don't want it extended in this area because of environmental damage and so on and so forth, which actually the party listened to. There are many cases where they don't listen to it, but the fact that they have started listening in a certain way, because they know that if they do not do that, the so-called 80,000 mass incidents which have happened every year for the last several years are likely to increase, and the disparities and stresses that I mentioned earlier will go on. The next area, very surprisingly for us, is the area of audit. The National Bureau of Audit in China is a surprisingly strong organization, with a person heading it given the name of the Iron Man. Am I right? He's called the Iron Man.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And he's a person who has unearthed an amazing number of scams and scandals, including stuff that has gone on in false SEZs and so on, much like our municipal corporations where you have large numbers of invisible people. And this man has actually unearthed a whole lot of that. Now, just like in our case, in many cases, no action is taken. But in some cases, action is taken. And in some cases, very significant action has been taken in response to these cases of scams and corruption. Because, as I said earlier, the party recognizes that this is an area which can bring it down. Corruption is an area of great danger for Chinese society. And therefore, the audit is an institution which is surprisingly strong and has survived. Now, by another strange coincidence, and by now you will have realized that all these are not coincidences, but by another strange coincidence, the institution of audit is very much like the institution of the imperial censor in the ancient Chinese imperial administration. The imperial censor that was instituted in the Han dynasty was a person directly appointed by the emperor who could travel anywhere in the country. He required no permission from anybody. He could go into anybody's territory and ask any citizen any question, and he reported directly back to the emperor himself. I mean, somewhat like our stories of Akbar and Iraq stories about Harun al-Rashid going into the market and asking people, asking citizens how they felt. So he could do all this, and therefore the emperor got a direct feedback about how his administration was doing. So it was a kind of precursor of audit, as it were, in those days. So I'm just giving these parallels that institutions which survive and are prosperous strangely seem to be repeats or reincarnations, to use our Indian word, of ancient institutions. So the Chinese are actually, to come back to Confucian thinking, have come down to a kind of finding that governance is not something that can be done by everybody. Governance requires training, governance requires knowledge, experience, wisdom, and education, and people have to be trained to be able to govern. And therefore, in a very funny way, the Chinese philosophy, if you take the Abraham Lincoln's philosophy of the United States as government of the people, for the people, and by the people, in a kind of Confucian amendment of that, the Chinese version would be of the people, for the people, but not necessarily by the people. It is governance by meritorious people, government by trained people, government by people who are equipped to govern, and equipped to govern in the what I call in the Confucian way. To us in India, it should not sound very strange, because if we go back to our own epics, and here I go into the last and concluding, I'm sure you'll be relieved to know that the concluding section of my talk, it should not sound strange to us, because in many ways our epics and our history also propounds this, that governance is a matter of people to be trained, and you are trained in two things. You are trained in the technology of governance, and you are trained in the virtues of governance. Dharmic training is as important as the training of weapons or arts or science. So, coming to the implication for India now, finally, and in closing, the implication for India is that just like China is looking within at itself and looking at its own heritage and tradition and crafting a way for itself in the move forward, so that Chinese modernization achieves the best of technology and science, which is a world which is offered to the entire world and universal, combining that with a governance system with its own genius. And this has been a Chinese thought for the last 2 or 3 centuries, which is expressed by the term that Chinese essence and Western technology, right? Chung Ti Qi Yong, if I am right. So this is something which we need to think about. But of course, some of our people have already thought about it, and I refer here once again to Mahatma Gandhi, that he thought of a system where India innovated from its own essence, and the way India achieved independence, and India used her own specific powers of rejuvenation, was something very unique. And the lesson I draw from what China has done, and China indeed is in the pathway of doing, is India perhaps also needs to look at herself and her own traditions and own knowledge to reinvigorate our own democracy. Just like China is trying to reinvigorate and reinvent itself using her own resources, India probably needs to do that, as Gandhi did at one time, but we seem to have lost that somewhere along the line. Maybe we need to do that somewhere. And if I believe these two countries, the two countries of a rising Asia, which Rabindranath Tagore at one time said that India, China and Japan are, as he said, the lamps that are lighting Asia. And on his visit to Korea, he said the lamp has been lit. And he was mentioning at that time Korea and Japan and China. India was still under British rule. So if the lamp can be lit in two of these major countries, which will comprise 2.5 billion people in the world, then it really is a very new direction. The Asian century, which Tagore first mentioned, and which recently was mentioned again by both Rajiv Gandhi and Deng Xiaoping during his visit, can really come back again. And this is made possible by the two countries in our own way, modernizing and taking all the advantages of modern science and technology